Hi, my name is Connor Flanagan. I'm the Director of Education from the Southampton History Museum, and today I'll be giving you a talk about my research on the Rogers family and some interesting facts I found along the way. A little history about myself before I start. I started at the museum in 2016 as I believe just a museum assistant, and then as time went on, the historic site manager, and then now the Director of Education. But prior to that, I actually started working in the summer of 2015 as an intern while I was still in school. I've sort of loved history my whole life, and it's been a pleasure to be able to work at the museum for this long and get involved in doing all this research on local history and people of interest. So the people we'll be talking about today is the people from the Rogers family, Harvard family, and the Shakespeare family. Two of these families are probably very well known to people who are not from around here. The Rogers family probably more specifically known to anybody that is from Southampton or is familiar with the museum at all. But these three, or two very famous, one locally famous families are connected in a pretty interesting way that I sort of stumbled upon the information sort of by accident. But we will start where I started. So I was doing some research on the Rogers family for actually a blog post that I did a little while ago. We decided to go back and post some of our old exhibit pieces into our blog for people who maybe missed those exhibits a few years ago when they were up, or people maybe forgotten. And it's also just great information, so we didn't want to just let it sit. So I decided, why not put it back out? One of those things was about the Rogers family, and it started off talking about their history. And so that's sort of how this all began. Now, the Rogers family in question, they are one of the founding families of Southampton, and they built the Rogers Mansion, which is the present-day home of the Southampton History Museum. So what you'll see on the bottom of the screen are two different shots of the building, one of the front and then another sort of aerial view of the back so you can see the whole structure. And then that drawing in the top corner that you'll see is actually a map that was done by William S. Pelletreau in Southampton in the mid-1800s. And that sort of laid out the history of Southampton Main Street and who actually owned those properties. And it's probably one of the most important, valuable pieces of history that we have at the museum. So many places have such a hard time really knowing who owned what property, when and where. You know, finding deeds of sale is always really difficult, especially when you get back to the 1700s and the 1600s. But there was somebody who was interested in doing this in the 1800s, and thank you to him, because he was able to talk to people who were alive at these points and remember where their grandfathers were, and they probably were able to find those records because they hadn't been destroyed yet. Where a piece of paper in 1600 that was made in 1600 probably was a little bit more easy to find in 1800 than it is in 2020. But so as you can see, starting at the very top, let me pull up the little annotation so I can circle this nicely. So here we have William Rogers. That's where we begin, where they were on the property originally around 1648. And then going down, you have Obadiah, Zephaniah, Herrick, Albert, and Cordelia Rogers. Now here, this pen markings on the glass over the map, not on the map itself. But that's circling Albert Rogers, who was the man that actually built the Rogers Mansion. This is a portrait that we have of Captain Albert Rogers. He was born on January 10th, 1807 in Southampton, New York, most likely in this house that we were just looking at. He married his first wife, Mary Halsey, around 1828, but she died on February 17th, 1835, before they had any children. He soon married his second wife, Cordelia Halsey, actually Mary's sister, on May 2nd, 1837. And they had three children: Mary Halsey Rogers, Jeter Rose Rogers, and Edwin Herrick Rogers. He earned his title of captain as a whaler and used his money that he made to build the Rogers Mansion around 1843. He retired as an offshore whaler in 1844, and he actually participated in the 1849 gold rush as a trustee of the Southampton and California Mining and Trading Company, which was famously unsuccessful. They sailed out of, I believe, Greenport. I might have that wrong. I believe it was Greenport, my apologies, aboard the Sabina. And they quickly found that the Sabina was maybe the worst boat they could have chosen, as it began to slowly sink as they were going, and they had to constantly do repairs as they were sailing from Long Island to California. But eventually, when they got there, very quickly they found out the gold rush was a very difficult job. Many of the men just immediately gave up. Some men actually did find success and decided to not share with the company and left on their own to keep all the money that they found. And then other people like Albert stayed for a little while and then just decided to come home. He lost his investment, but didn't lose his life like many other men actually did. He continued to hunt whales near the shore, and on one such occasion, his boat was actually struck by a whale, causing him to sustain an injury so bad that he had to have a limb amputated. And this actually led to his death, where he died a few days later by lockjaw on June 17th, 1854, at the age of 47. So I'm going to go back one slide so we can see the Rogers Mansion as it is today. So this is the building that Albert built. He is most likely, most importantly known for constructing the Greek Revival section of the building, which I'm going to grab my little annotation thing again. This squared structure here is his addition to the Rogers Mansion property. Now, all the back parts that we see, there were some additions made later on. Like this part was added after he owned the property. Some of these other parts were added a little bit different as time went on, but he built that main square structure. It is actually believed that this back section may have been actually there prior to him doing his constructions on the home, but we'll get to that in just a few seconds. Moving backward in time, we're talking about his father now, Captain Herrick Rogers. So you'll see below where the titles are and I have their names, we're going to be having their relations to Albert Rogers going backward. So this Herrick Rogers is his father. He was born May 4th, 1775, married his first wife, Hannah Rose, in 1797, and they had one son, Jeter Rogers, who died in 1822. He then formed a mercantile business with his brother-in-law, Micah Herrick, called Herrick Rogers and Company, which was very successful. He was also the commissioner of highways and schools for the town of Southampton during his lifetime, and was also a lieutenant under Abram Rose in 1806, and later earned the title of captain in the army. He married his second wife, Phoebe Sayer, on March 2nd, 1805. So a few years after his first marriage ended, and they gave birth to his son, Captain Albert Rogers, who we were just speaking about. He eventually died on June 18th, 1827, at the age of 52 years old. What we see up here in the corner is actually the notice of his death and their sale of some of the items from the house. So it reads, I know it might be a little difficult, for sale at public auction on Thursday, the 20th September next at 10 o'clock a.m. at the late residence of Herrick Rogers, deceased in Southampton, the goods of said deceased in the store consisting of dry goods, groceries, crockery, I think it's saying et cetera, also a number of empty casks and other articles not mentioned. And then it gives more information about that. And that is actually part of our historic structure report, where I found that little newspaper article, which you can, again, see on our website, which is really helpful in putting together all this information. Going back in time a little bit more, we now have the grandfather, Captain Zephaniah Rogers. He was born January 25th, 1742. In his lifetime, he served as a commissioner of highways and as a constable. He earned his title of captain while serving in the American Revolution. But we're not exactly sure who he fought for. We'll get to that slightly in a second. But you would always sort of assume that when we're talking about these people, that they would be fighting for the Americans, of course, right? He married his wife, Elizabeth Sayer, around 1769, and they had 6 children, all girls except for Herrick. He died October 29, 1796, at the age of 54 years old. What we have over here on the right-hand side of the screen is some plans, some conjectural plans from the historic structure report that I was mentioning just before that really helped with my research and just the family, because most of it was already been done, thankfully. But these were the ideas that we had for the layout of the house before Captain Albert Rogers' reconstruction. So William Rogers, who we'll learn about a little bit later on in this talk, was the original founder of the Rogers family in Southampton, that top drawing being most likely a general layout of what his house may have looked like. Below, we have the layout from 1780 when Zephaniah Rogers lived in this house. That back section is the back section that I was talking about before on the house that we believe may actually be remnants from Zephaniah Rogers. I believe there was a leak around 2015 that they were doing some repairs on, and when opening up some of the walls, they found some old posts that look a lot older than the ones that are down in the basement, that you can see easier from the Captain Albert Rogers construction than the Zephaniah construction. So sections of the home maybe even as old as around 1780, which is really interesting. So here we are, the great-grandfather, Captain Obadiah Rogers III. He was born 1699, and in his life he served the town of Southampton as a town clerk for several years, as well as a trustee, overseer of the poor, and a fence viewer. He married his wife, Abigail Herrick, around 1721, and they had several children, but only 3 survived to maturity. Zephaniah was the youngest of these. Here in his titles, captain by serving in the Revolutionary War. Notes that I found in the structure report mentioned that he was captain of a British schooner named the Britannia, which was captured in 1777 by the Connecticut sloop America, which was captained by a man named Asa Palmer. It looks as though he may have fought for the British. And because of this, he most likely continued to live in the Rogers Mansion property during the British occupation of Long Island throughout the war. One of the earliest battles in the American Revolution was the Battle of Long Island, where George Washington was defeated and the British took Long Island as their own. Everybody that lived in Long Island was a prisoner of war during that time, and many men fled, but I guess some, like the Rogers family, may have stayed. I don't have any concrete evidence about this yet. A lot of this is all very much preliminary research that I'm just trying to compile now. And so I really need to dig a lot deeper to find out if he actually was fighting for the British, or if they were fighting for the Americans, or if they fought at all. This could very easily be a different Obadiah Rogers. But in the sources that I was looking through, it talks about an Obadiah Rogers from Southampton. Most likely was our Obadiah Rogers, who was fighting against America. Going back a little bit farther, we now have his father, the second great-grandfather, Obadiah Rogers Jr. He was born September 24th, 1655, and the first of the Rogers Mansion owners to be born in Southampton. He married his first wife, Sarah Howell, around 1863. However, she died around the time of the birth of their only child, Irene, who also died, both in 1685. He married his second wife, Mary Lupton Clark, sometime after 1685, and they had 4 children, with 2 dying young. Upon his father's death in 1692, his older brother, Zechariah, was given the Rogers Mansion property, but Zechariah died a few years afterwards with no heirs or wife to leave his property to, so Obadiah Jr. was able to inherit the property, which included a barn, orchard, garden, a shop, and some tools. He was heavily involved in town administration for most of his life, and his most prominent role was as a trustee. He died May 5th, 1729, at the age of 74 years old. A running theme through most of the Rogers family is their connection with really town governance, really helping out with many different facets of town operations. Sorry, wrong way. There we go. Obadiah Rogers Sr. now, the third great-grandfather and the last of the Obadiahs, or I guess first of the Obadiahs. He was born September 24th, 1633 in Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire, England. What we see over here is actually the crest of Stratford-upon-Avon. That may sound familiar to some of you. We'll get to that connection soon. He married his wife, Mary Russell, in 1654, and they had 7 children. He worked as a constable, overseer, and also served as a juror. He died June 23rd, 1692 in Southampton, New York at the age of 59 years old. So he was the first, so his son was the first born in Southampton to own the property, and Obadiah Rogers was the last not born in Southampton to own the Rogers Mansion property. And now we're back at the 4th great-grandfather of Captain Albert Rogers, William Rogers. He was born February 7th, 1612 in Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire, England. He married his wife, Anne Hall, sometimes maybe referred to as Anna Hall. In 1630, they had 7 children, and they arrived in the U.S. sometime around 1635, most likely in the Massachusetts area first, or perhaps somewhere else in New England. But soon after arriving, they were living in and around New Haven, Connecticut. They came to Southampton soon after it was first established, and they were actually part of the laying out of Main Street, and he was given his lot of land around 1645, where the Rogers Mansion stands today. So while they were not part of the very first people to come to Southampton, they were probably there maybe the second or third trip in, and really helped with the laying out of the whole town area. Soon after helping with the establishment of Southampton, William actually left to head west and assisted in the establishment of Huntington, New York, where he lived the rest of his life and is most likely buried somewhere around there. I have not been able to track down exact whereabouts of his grave, but that'll be sort of the next part of my journey doing this research. He died on November 22nd, 1669 in Huntington, New York at the age of 57 years old. Oddly enough, the majority of these Rogers guys all sort of lived about the same amount of time. All dying between like 50 and 60 years old. Now going back a bit farther, we get to Thomas Rogers Jr., who is the 5th great-grandfather of Captain Albert Rogers. He was born June 11th, 1587 in Stratford-upon-Avon, and was married around 1607 and had several children. He worked as a maltster, someone who produces malt for brewing beer, and he inherited his father's property in 1611, and upon his death, passed it to one of his sons, Edward Rogers, a bookbinder. He died August 31st, 1639, in Stratford-upon-Avon at the age of 52 years old. So this is where we are now staying in England. So he had several children, one of whom was William Rogers, that left England and came to America and was involved with the founding of Southampton, also Huntington, and a big player here on Long Island. But his other son, Edward Rogers, actually inherited his family's home in England, which is one of the most famous houses probably in England, and many of you probably maybe have heard of it before, and it is something known as the Harvard House. And that was built by the 6th great-grandfather of Captain Albert Rogers, Thomas Rogers Sr., who was born 1540 in Stratford-upon-Avon. Married his first wife, Elizabeth Potter, November 27, 1561. However, she died soon after, but he was married twice more, first to Margaretta Pace and then Alice Calley, or I think Calley, yeah. They had 3 children with his last wife, Thomas Rogers Jr. being one of them. Thomas Rogers Sr. was a successful butcher, corn and cattle merchant, and served as an alderman for the Stratford Corporation alongside a man by the name of John Shakespeare. Now, an alderman, in case anyone is not familiar, is almost essentially like a town trustee. So the Stratford Corporation was basically the corporation of the town of Stratford-upon-Avon, and they worked together, make sure the goings on in the town were going how they should be, laws being followed, things like that. That home that he built is pictured here and is the Harvard House, and it was built around 1596, and it still stands today and is cared forward by the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. He died February 20th, 1610 in Stratford-upon-Avon, around 70 years old. So the oldest so far of the Rogers family to survive, as long as his birth date is correct. But the interesting enough about the house, I believe carved on the door into the house is the initials of him and his wife, which is a nice, lovely thing. But the house actually still stands today. And once quarantine is over, and then if you're able to go to England, you can go to Stratford-upon-Avon and actually visit this home. So if I do ever get a chance to go to England, this would be a place where I just want to go. Kind of makes sense working at Rogers Mansion. I have to go back to there, right? But going back a little bit farther, we get back to William Rogers, who's the 7th grandfather. As you can see, not a lot of information here. He was born around 1510 in a town called Derrytend, I believe, Warwickshire, England, which is about 40 minutes north of Stratford. He married his wife, who I believe was named Matilda England, around 1539. The last name might be incorrect. But he died February 4th, 1555, somewhere in Warwickshire. Wasn't very specific. Could be Derrytend, could have been Stratford. But his father was a man by the name of John Rogers, the 8th great-grandfather in this line. He was born circa 1485 in Derryton, Warwickshire, His wife was Margaret Wyatt, and he worked as a lorimer, I believe, which is the maker of bits and spurs for riding horses. So that's like the piece that the horse bites in their mouth and the spurs that you would wear on your shoes. They had at least two sons, one William Rogers and the other Reverend John Fitz Rogers, the Martyr. John Rogers died on February 25th, 1521 in Derryton at the age of around 36 years old, the youngest so far of the Rogers pass away. The reason we go back this far is to talk about one of the more famous, I guess probably the most famous of the Rogers line that we can make connection to from our Southampton Rogers, and that would be the Reverend John Fitz Rogers, the Martyr. So he would be, I guess technically, I believe the 7th great-granduncle. I'm not great with my naming of genealogical lines, so if I'm incorrect here, please someone let me know. But this man was born February 4th, 1507 in Derryton. He attended the Guild School of St. John the Baptist and Pembroke Hall, which is part of Cambridge University, where he graduated in 1526. From 1532 to 34, he was the rector at the Holy Trinity, the Less in London, and practiced Roman Catholicism. He eventually went on a trip to Antwerp soon after 1534, which is in Belgium, where he soon met William Tyndale, who was an English expat living in Belgium and was part of the Protestant Reformation. Now, England at this time was practicing Roman Catholicism, and the Protestant Reformation was taking a large foothold throughout Europe. It hadn't really had its real big brush up yet in England, but had many things had occurred throughout Europe, with people being executed and a lot of horrible atrocities going on. And this William Tyndale influenced Rogers greatly, and together they worked on a new translation of the Bible into English. While living outside England, John Rogers became a really big part of this Protestant Reformation, and eventually returning to England in 1548, where he began to spread his Protestant message. Eventually, he was sent to Newgate Prison in January 1554, and he died February 4th, 1554, in Smithfield, London, England, at the age of 47 years old, by way of burning at the stake. Quite a way to go. You see a picture here on the side of the actual execution, and the words coming out of his mouth says, "Lord, receive my spirit." He was the first Protestant martyr executed under Queen Mary I, also known as Queen of the Scots Mary, who was very determined to keep England and the UK in general as a Roman Catholic country. So she was not a big fan of the Rogers family probably at this point. So now we're going to start making our connection to the Harvard family, starting with Robert Harvard, who is related to us, and he would be the 5th great-granduncle. He was born around 1562 in a town called Surrey, England, which is in London. He was a butcher and owned a tavern. He married his first wife, Barbara Deston, in 1600, and they had 2 children, Mary, who lived, and Robert, who died young. Barbara would die of actually the plague around 1603. He soon married his second wife, Catherine Rogers, in April of 1605. Catherine was the sister of Thomas Rogers Jr., and they had 2 children before Robert would die, and Catherine would remarry 2 more times before her eventual death in 1635. Robert Harvard, as I said, he passed away in 1625 in Southwark, Surrey, England, at the age of 63 years old. Their son was Reverend John Harvard, the first cousin 6 times removed. So quite, I guess, barely related, but still related in some way. This man was born November 29th, 1607 in Southwark, Surrey, England. Went to the University of Cambridge and got his BA in 1632 and his master's in 1635. He married his wife, Anne Sadler, on April 19th, 1636, and they had no children. They emigrated to New England in the summer of 1637, where John was a teacher and a preacher. He died soon after, on September 14th, 1638, in Charlestown, Massachusetts, of tuberculosis at 31 years old. Now, I assume we all are somewhat familiar with this last name of Harvard, but what is Reverend John Harvard's connection with Harvard as we know it? Harvard College was founded in 1636 and located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and is the undergraduate college of Harvard University. It's the oldest institution of higher learning in the United States, and Massachusetts Bay Colony voted to create the college, originally called Newtown, which was soon renamed to Cambridge after Cambridge University in England. That was all done in 1636. But the school was soon renamed again after Reverend John Harvard's death in 1638. John Harvard's parents and brother had all died before him, leaving him a large financial estate. He had no children and split his monetary estate in half between his wife and the college. One half of his financial estate was equal to the colony's, the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony's annual tax receipts. So this was a massive sum of money that nobody was really probably prepared for at this time. And he was also able to donate his entire library, which consisted of over 400 volumes. Because of this donation, Harvard College, which was then called Cambridge College, decided pretty quickly to rename themselves in honor of Reverend John Harvard because of his donation of books and the massive amount of money, which propelled them throughout the future to today become probably one of the most prestigious colleges and universities in the entire world. And now we're going to trace back a little bit to talk about the Shakespeares. First, we're going to talk about John Shakespeare. Now, this line of very famous other people they are not directly related to the Rogers family, but they play an important role. John Shakespeare was born around 1531 in Snitterfield, Warwickshire, England. He married his wife, Mary Arden, circa 1557, and they had 8 children, 5 of whom survived to adulthood. He was a leather worker by trade and also an alderman and bailiff of Stratford-upon-Avon. That would be also what we would call a mayor. And he got that position around 1568. He died on September 7th, 1601 at the age of 70 years old. Now, John Shakespeare is probably most famous for being the father of William Shakespeare. He was born sometime before April 26th, 1564, which is when his baptism occurred, in Stratford-upon-Avon. He married his wife, Anne Hathaway, on November 27th, 1582, and they had several children. Interestingly enough, William Shakespeare, I believe, was only 18 years old when they got married, with his wife being around 26 years old. He became one of, if not the most famous playwright of all time. I don't have very much information on here because I feel like most of you probably are very familiar with William Shakespeare, and we're not going to really talk about his life's work. Really just need to know that of him being an extremely famous individual. And he eventually died on April 23rd, 1616 at 52 years old. But how do they all connect? So here we have the Rogers family, the Shakespeare family, and the Harvard family. The Shakespeares and the Harvards being extraordinarily famous, the Rogers being very famous in Southampton. But where does this connection come from? How does it happen? It starts with Thomas Rogers, who was alive 1540, 1610, and the builder of the Harvard House. And he worked alongside John Shakespeare, 1531 to 1601. They were both aldermen in Stratford-upon-Avon, with John Shakespeare actually serving as mayor for a short time in that area as well. They both were most likely working together at some point around 1575. This would have been the time when Thomas Rogers was a bit older, being able to hold his position. They may have been working together a bit sooner, but I'm not exactly certain when they were both aldermen. But because of this, and because of also Stratford being a fairly small town, their children probably would have been friends. They were also all born around the same time. John Shakespeare's having some of actually Thomas Rogers' later children not being born around the same time as the Shakespeares, but his older children all were around the same age. They would have probably gone to school together and most likely would have been friends. One can assume that John's son, William Shakespeare, would have probably made friends with the Rogers family children, either with the ones around his age, maybe a little older, a little younger, but they had to have known each other at the very least. In 1599, William Shakespeare, who was alive 1564 to 1616, moved to Southwark, London, England. However, he had been living and working in London since around 1585. And this is where Robert Harvard, born 1562 to 1625, was living at the time. Robert Harvard and the owner of the Rose Theatre, where Shakespeare performed, were part of the same church, St. Saviour's. Over here on the side, we have an illustration of that church in London, England. Now, Robert Harvard may have personally known William Shakespeare. There's no exact record of them ever knowing each other or interacting or anything like that, but given the fact that going to church at this time was almost compulsory, it wasn't really an option. If you were going to be anybody in society, you had to be going to church. The owner of the Rose Theater and Robert Harvard working together within the church made sense that they would have known each other. And with Shakespeare being as famous as he was and working at the Rose Theater, he most likely was also attending the same church. And at the very least, Robert Harvard would have known who he was, if not personally known him. And by the end of 1603, Robert Harvard was a widower with a young daughter, and normally people would remarry quite fast at this time, but Robert didn't. He would not remarry until 1605. So why did he wait 2 years? Maybe he was looking for his true love or grieving his first wife, or there's plenty of different ideas or reasons why it could have taken 2 years for him to find his next wife. But from 1596 to 1602, Shakespeare would go between Southwark and Stratford frequently visiting his family. So the years prior to Robert Harvard's wife passing away, Shakespeare was popping back and forth between the two areas of his birth and where he was gaining all his fame. Probably pretty easy to do so given the fact that he was becoming quite wealthy at the time. And in fact, his father had lost the majority of his family's money, but in 1596, Shakespeare was quite wealthy and was able to return home and sort of save his family financially. And in 1602, in fact, Shakespeare purchased his home called New Place in Stratford, where he would live until his death in 1616. And pictured here is a sketch of that home that Shakespeare would have lived in. Sadly, it doesn't exist anymore, but in its place is a really fantastic garden. Now, 1605, Robert Harvard marries Catherine Rogers, as we discussed before, who gives birth to Reverend John Harvard, who later is a founder of Harvard College. So without Robert Harvard and Catherine Rogers meeting, there's a good chance that Harvard University would never exist. It would never, it would probably still exist. It might be called Cambridge America or something like that. And they wouldn't have had that big influx of money, and who knows what could have happened to it. Would have really changed the course of history because of how many important and powerful people actually went to that school. But really, how did they meet? Normally, this wouldn't really be a question when you're doing this sort of research, because when you find in genealogical records in the 1600s of this guy marrying this lady, you would somewhat assume that they're from the same area. But when you find out that Robert Harvard was born and lived in Southwark, London, England, and Catherine Rogers was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire, England, and you look at a map at how far they are apart, they're very far. Here I just have a screenshot that I took earlier from Google Maps showing the distance between the places. They're over 100 miles from each other. Even present day, it would take 2 hours to drive between the two areas. And so if you take out cars, you take out modern roads, you give someone a horse and a carriage, I can imagine how long it would actually take to get from one place to the other. Now, Shakespeare would be traveling this distance maybe once or twice a year because he had the money and he had reason. He was going home to see his family, and he was going to London to work, to continue gaining all his fame. But there would be absolutely no reason for Catherine Rogers to go to London, maybe other than to see a play of Shakespeare's. And there would be no reason for Robert Harvard to go to Stratford other than to just tag along with his friend Shakespeare. So one way or the other, Shakespeare is the connection here between the Rogers family and the Harvard family. When Robert Harvard was either grieving his first wife or actually looking for a new one, but having some troubles, maybe he went to Shakespeare for help. In Henry C. Shelley's John Harvard and His Times, when discussing this, the author writes, Warwickshire maidens, even to this day, which this book was written in 1907, are by no means the least beautiful among the daughters in England. And judging from her subsequent conquest as a widow, Catherine Rogers undoubtedly possessed more than average attractions. And what that means is essentially her next two husbands were also fairly wealthy tradesmen, And she was able to, always being able to marry into nice families, and not only that, but 3 times. I've never been to Warwickshire. I don't believe I've ever met any women from Warwickshire, so I can't attest to how beautiful they may or may not be. But it's an interesting joke by this author to, talking about potentially that she was just very pretty. And with the Rogers and the Shakespeare family being family friends for a long period of time, if Shakespeare knew that his friend Robert was looking for a wife, maybe he would think to himself when he was home one day that, oh, Catherine's single, Robert's single, maybe they can get together. Sort of playing matchmaker. There is no hard evidence for this, but it is sort of a widely accepted idea and story about how these 2 families came together. And I think it's a quite interesting one. It's mostly circumstantial evidence, so we can't really rely on this as direct evidence of this occurring. But again, like I said, it's just a quite interesting fact. And it all sort of came to me while just doing some general research on the Rogers family, looking around Ancestry.com, reading some articles online. Mostly now that we're home during quarantine, I don't have access to our swath of archives and books at the museum. So I'm able to go in every now and then, which is where actually I got the book, John Harvard and His Times, which was recommended to me by my coworker, Lori Collins, when we did an exhibit on the Rogers family years ago, and somebody actually donated this book to us, suggesting that we read it to find out about the history. So she said I'd probably find interesting information there. And I did, which sort of led to this whole talk. So I want to thank you all for joining me in this sort of look at the research I've been doing. And now if anybody does have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. What you can do is you can either submit your questions through the Q&A function through Zoom, which, sorry, I just have to like get out of this PowerPoint for myself and get my screen back. Okay. You can either submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, which if you go down to the toolbar, you'll see there's a Q&A button. Click that, it'll open a new window. You can submit your questions that way, or you can go to the general chat function and you can click that where people can submit their questions that way. Also, if anybody is watching on Facebook, please feel free to submit questions there. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. But again, I will say that this talk in particular, I do know a good amount about the Rogers family, but I'm still doing a lot of research on all the particulars of this stuff. Let's see. Do you have a picture of the garden that replaced Shakespeare's home? Yes. I don't exactly, but I can find one pretty easily. So the home itself, new place that Shakespeare lived out the final part of his life in, I believe burned down. I could be mistaken, but if you Google New Place Garden, England, which I can share my screen quickly to show everyone, you can see there's a lot of great stuff going on here. So the whole area, really Stratford-upon-Avon, the town itself that still exists today, their whole tourist attraction is really based on the Shakespeare family, which honestly, of course it is. So that whole area is really well preserved, and they do a lot of great work to keep things nice. And the area that that home lived on was on is now preserved as this garden, which you can go and tour and check out. So if anyone ever goes to England, as you saw on that one map, Stratford's only about 2 hours away from London, so it's probably fairly easy to get there, at least in modern times. So I would highly suggest going to see this garden, see the Harvard House, and everything else that the town might have to offer. Let's see. Another question we have, how did William Rogers come to America? An interesting question. So William Rogers, I mean, the technical how is he came on a boat. But how, like which boat and what day is still somewhat of a mystery. When colonists were coming to America in the early times, there was that first ship, the Mayflower, that came to America and landed in Plymouth. Soon after that, there were a few more trips that happened. The Mayflower actually made a few more trips. And on that journey, they were sometimes, a lot of people were coming from this place called Linden, Holland, where a lot of separatists from England actually moved to from religious persecution, stemming from the Protestant Reformation and all that sort of stuff going on. From there, they then came to America in search of religious freedom. Many more people came around that same time, with William Rogers being one of these people. A sort of famously known story, at least within the people who are doing genealogy work on the Rogers family, is that aboard the Mayflower, one of the people's names was Thomas Rogers. As you may remember from my talk just now, there was a few Thomas Rogers I mentioned. Those people were most likely different Thomas Rogers, almost unequivocally different people. Thomas, very popular first name, Rogers, a very popular last name. It just so happens that there was two Thomas Rogers that were somewhat fairly important in history now. So a lot of people make that mistake when doing this research, thinking that our William Rogers is descendant from that Thomas Rogers. In fact, the museum, when we did our exhibit on the family, originally made that mistake, and had to rectify it in our exhibit that was up on the walls. So it's a popular idea that's out there. I believe there's a few people that are still trying to make that argument that the R. Rogers line is connected to the Pilgrims line, but the more widely accepted idea is that they are actually not related in any way. But that doesn't mean that we're not related to anybody interesting, as we can go back and make that connection to the Harvard family very directly. The happenstance of how the Harvard family and the Rogers family came together is sort of up for speculation, but it is definitively proved that we are related to that family. So it is quite interesting. Maybe I should also go visit Harvard College at some point. But yeah, let's see. If anybody else has any other questions, please feel free to submit them. I gotta look in like 3 different places. I'll see. Facebook doesn't appear we have any questions there. I don't think we have any more in the chat, and I don't think we have any more here. So what I'll do, again, before we leave, I just want to let anybody know who was not here before about our upcoming talks. So if you enjoyed today's talk, thank you. But if you want to watch any of our other ones, if you go to our website, southamptonhistory.org/calendar, you'll be able to see all of our upcoming programs. Our next one is right here, May 20th. It's a Wednesday, and that is, what time is that at? I believe it's at, 12 p.m. That's actually hosted by the Rogers Memorial Library. So that is Women War Correspondents Vietnam. So you're gonna be learning all about Vietnam War, and specifically some of the brave women that are actually out there reporting on what was going on. The next lecture that we're actually hosting is gonna be the following day, on Thursday, May 21st at 11 a.m., same place, same time, celebrating Southampton, the 275th and 375th anniversaries, presented by my coworker, curator and registrar Zachary Taylor. And then right after that, on the 29th, Friday, we have Conscience Point by Trevor Wormfeld. It's a really fantastic documentary. If you haven't already seen it, I highly suggest that you RSVP for this program. This program itself will be a Q&A with the director, but also if you RSVP for it, you'll be sent a link so that way you can watch the film. We work closely with a production company to be able to host the film online for 1 week, so that way you'll be able to watch it. Enjoy the film. It's really great, really powerful, especially if you live in Southampton, work in Southampton, or just interested with Native Americans and their relation to the land and present day America and sort of how things are going on. It's a really great movie. Can't really recommend it enough. So please watch it. Join us for the Q&A. Bring some great questions. Should be great. We do have also a lot more programs set up for June. We have a few of them in here now. I'll be updating our website probably this afternoon and tomorrow with all of our new programs that we just got confirmed. So there'll be a lot more going on. You can also go to our blog, which is featured on our website, where we're putting up multiple things a week, talking about all sorts of different things. We have our deep dive exhibit where we're talking about all sorts of objects in depth from our collection. This one was just posted yesterday about this really great small carving that we have in our museum. Normally I'd say come by and take a look, but because you can't do that now, you can go to our website and you can get a nice look at this and read all about it. Also on our website, we are posting sort of more long form research topics, which this was actually going to be one until we decided to make it into a lecture. but my coworker Lori Collins just did one about the Pelletreau Silver Shop. So it's a great quick read, the brief history of the Pelletreau Silver Shop, which is one of our properties. You can not exactly visit today, but you can certainly put a mask on and walk by it. It's on Main Street in Southampton, and this talks about the history of that building. And it's really great. And again, I want to say that this blog, the talk I just gave, all the future talks that we're doing, they're all free. We give this to everybody, and we've always given these things to people, and we want to make sure that we're able to continue to do this. So what we're going to do is ask for your support. If you are able to, there's two really great ways you can do so. One is to become a member of the Southampton History Museum. If you go to our membership page, you can scroll through here and select whatever membership level works for you. There are all sorts of different price points, from $35 being the lowest normal rate, $25 if you're under the age of 35, all the way up to $5,000. But even if you were just took the smallest one right now, it'd be more than helpful. What you can also do if you're already a member, or if you don't want to become a member, you can just go to our donate page and hit this button. It'll take you to PayPal, where you can donate as little as $1 or as much money as you're able to. Again, all these programs we're doing for everybody have always been free, and they'll continue to be free, but we do want to have your support. So again, thank you everybody for joining me this morning. Hopefully you'll join us for our next talk, and have a good day.